Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Carrie Brenner, and I'm a palliative care physician here at Stanford and chair of the Jonathan J. King Lectureship Committee. On behalf of the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics, welcome to the 32nd Annual Jonathan J. King Lecture. Tonight is the first time we are hosting a hybrid presentation. So we have a small group here in person at Stanford, and we have hundreds more viewing through our live stream from across the globe. Thank you for joining this momentous event. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to give you a history and background of the lectureship itself. Jonathan King was a gifted computer scientist and a philosopher, but above all, he was a humanist with a deep concern for the dignity of all individuals. In 1991, 3 weeks before dying of cancer at the young age of 41, Dr. King defined key messages that he wished to impart to the medical community through this lectureship. He emphasized the importance of empathy with his patients. He also highlighted a need to provide patients with hope, comfort, and a measure of control. Thus, the Jonathan King Lectureship was established here at Stanford. And for over 30 years, this series has featured superb medical humanists from around the country. It's become an integral part of Stanford Healthcare's mission to embrace patient care and to advocate for the human elements of medicine. Every year, we show a brief video presentation of Jonathan King so we can remember who he was as a person and the vision that inspired this annual event. So let's pause together and look back over 3 decades ago with the following photos and personal reflections from Jonathan King in this video.
I have a wife whom I love very much. I have 2 boys who are about to turn 6 and 12. I spend a lot of time with them. I'm working on my projects as much as I can. And this I consider to be a very important activity also, because there are some things that I learned throughout this experience about what's important to me as a patient when you cross that line, and what you need to do, and what the medical staff and your wider support groups and everybody else can do to help or to make things worse. I think that's really the important thing. I think the main one is just common sense. And that is to empathize, to put yourself in the shoes of your patient as much as possible. Many of the things I'm going to say really lead back to that principle. And I know that flies in the face a little bit of the training of professional detachment. And believe me, I appreciate how important it is for a doctor, especially an oncologist, who has to deal with patients like me, who they feel, with all their scientific training, is going to die, and it won't be very pleasant. That they have to go home at night and deal with their 6 and 12-year-olds and everything else. And that's essential, and I don't begrudge them that at all. But they really have to put themselves in your shoes as much as they can and understand what's going on with you. There's a line that divides people who have passed over into the condition I'm in from everybody else. I can't really put it into words. I think you understand what I mean. In a way, there's no way that I can convey to you this feeling of the death sentence and how it changes your life. It's something you'll probably hear many times in your career. But you just have to appreciate that that's there, and that as far as possible, get as close to your patient as you can. Second thing, and also very important to me, in this kind of situation, and I'm talking about a situation where the odds are really very poor, where your scientific training says from day one, a reasonable thing to do in your case would be just to take narcotics and go fishing. And that was in fact suggested to me on day one and throughout. That, you can stop. You don't have to do this. But I think the second point I'd like to emphasize is how important it is for the doctors, the medical staff, to foster a patient's feeling of control and of hope to whatever extent you can.
Hearing those reflections from Jonathan King allows us to recall what's most important when patients are suffering from serious illness. Although that video is from decades ago, Dr. King's message continues to resonate with the values that we strive to inculcate in medicine today. Tonight's speaker embodies these values and inspires them in countless others. It is now my great pleasure to introduce this speaker, Dr. Louise Aronson. Dr. Aronson is a geriatrician, award-winning writer, and professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, where she also is the director of the UCSF Medical Humanities. Dr. Aronson is cherished by her patients, colleagues, and students. This is evident by her numerous awards for her extraordinary clinical work and teaching, such as the Gold Professorship of Humanism in Medicine, the American Geriatric Society Clinician Teacher of the Year, and the California Home Care Physician of the Year Award. As a fun personal fact, Louise is a fifth-generation San Franciscan. She actually was born in the same medical center where she now works. So this often prompts Louise to joke that she hasn't gone very far in life. Just about 15 floors down and a building over, she says. But it's evident that Dr. Aronson has gone quite far in life, and she has actually catalyzed our culture to go with her. As an esteemed scholar, Dr. Aronson has been published in the most prestigious journals, JAMA, The Lancet, and the New England Journal of Medicine. As an advocate for cultural change, she has been featured on NPR, The Today Show, CBS This Morning, and the New York Times. She draws upon her clinical acumen and personal experience to illuminate topics of great social relevance. Dr. Aronson is a masterful storyteller and a gifted writer. Her first book, A History of the Present Illness, offers a deeply humane and incisive portrait of health and illness in America today. Her most recent book, Elderhood, is a New York Times bestseller and was the 2020 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction. Elderhood is not simply a book. It's a call to action. It advocates for a new paradigm to redefine aging and to transform medicine. Dr. Aronson, thank you for being here with us tonight as we consider together how to revolutionize our healthcare systems and society to integrate the unique challenges and opportunities with aging. We look forward to growing from your shared wisdom.
Thank you. Thanks, Carrie. And thanks to all of you for being such wonderful hosts, and to the King family for giving me this honor to talk to you all today. I would like to say I could fix the healthcare system in the next 39 minutes, but that's not going to happen. So let's just set expectations appropriately. What I am going to do is something that we like to do both in science and in the humanities, and that is to begin by defining some of the terms, and actually even the terms in the title. The first one is elderhood. Now, it's actually kind of funny. So I called the book Elderhood for a reason, which I'll come to in a moment. But sometimes when referring it, people will say, elder care. And I kind of get that, but that's very, very different from what I'm talking about. And then the other one that if somebody could explain to me, it would be helpful, is elderwood. I really don't know what that is. It could be sort of a Grimm's metaphor, Freudian slip sort of thing, but anyway, let's move on. The way I prefer to think about it is as a major life stage. And actually, you can go back to cave paintings, 43 to 65,000 years, they have trouble narrowing it down, ago, and you saw children and adults and you saw old people. And yet we, in American society, have sort of made old this thing that you are when you are frail. But I would say that anybody who's even reached a certain point in mid-age knows that isn't quite right. It's not a switch thrown or an end point. It's a life stage that nowadays lasts decades. And that actually offers us all kinds of opportunities for innovation. And we are the generations who get to figure out how to do this. I mean, we have Laura Carstensen here who's doing all that exactly for us. So it's really making it bigger instead of smaller, because things that are bigger are more interesting and get more attention. When you Google the human lifespan, you get many pictures like this. There's a problem. So, yeah, I feel like it's not quite proportional. Anybody else feel that way? And then I tried to redo it, and I still don't think I have it quite right. But there's another problem, we don't even have language for most of this, right? So I figure I'm about here, and I have a mother who's still alive, and she's not in a wheelchair, and she's had 30 years of all kinds of things happening in between, as have most of my patients, and we don't even have a language for that. But for kids, we have infant, toddler, child, tween, teen, and even for adults, we have the young adult and the middle-aged adult. And we know that a neonate is different than a teen, and a 20-year-old is different than a 60-year-old. But, then after that, it's like all one big thing, and it's called old. Not so helpful. In medicine also, we have pediatrics, and we have adult medicine. Internal medicine says it covers everything. And it does. And maybe if we didn't already divide health by age, that would be okay. And maybe if we hadn't learned so much about how to take care of humans over the last 50 years, that would be okay. But it's actually really hard to know enough about 22-year-olds and 102-year-olds and everybody in between. So there is this field of geriatrics, but there's like 3 people in it. And, and why is that? I think part of it is it's that we're all ageist, and I'll come back to that. And part of it is that we make age so small, and that's a mistake. There are, of course, people in family and community medicine who do it all, and hats off to them. I actually felt philosophically that was a good way to go, but I'm too anxious a person, so that didn't happen. But really, you think about it as we think about life in a 3-act play. Each act has a significance, but that significance is different than what happens in the other acts of the play. So it's this bigger, more varied view of the third phase of life. Obviously, one of its problems is that it's the last phase of life, and people don't kind of like the terminus very much, but Carrie can talk to you more about that. This is Ursula Le Guin, who died a year or 2 before the pandemic, and she has some great quotes about aging from one of her later books. One of it is, if I'm 90 and believe I'm 45, I'm headed for a very bad time trying to get out of the bathtub. But this hasn't always reached medicine, right? So let's study the 40-year-olds, but then let's apply the results to the 90-year-olds. And then when it goes badly, let's blame old age instead of bad science. She also says this: to tell me my old age doesn't exist is to tell me I don't exist. It's an important part of who we are, like it or not. And there are good things and bad things that come along with it. Okay, so that was the first term, elderhood. Next is reimagining. And that's to think differently about something. And I think we only make progress with old age if we think about it differently. I've begun to allude to that, and hopefully in the rest of the talk we'll get to some of the other ways you can do that. But there are statistics like this, the U-shaped curve of happiness, which some people have pushed back on. But if you look at the bulk of the data, it's not always such a clear smiley face, admittedly, if you really look at the data carefully. And of course, you're going to be happier if you can eat every day of your life than if you're starving half your life, and likely to, die at 42. But there is something to this. And we don't really hear those things as much as we should. So part of reimagining old age is to not just discuss the losses, but discuss the gains. And there are gains. I sort of like this partly because I'm at that part where we're really anxious, but we're starting to get happier and more satisfied. So I'm feeling good about that. I could use a little less anxiety. But are there things to look forward to that you don't tell young people? Like today, walking through Stanford, and I saw people in classes, and it's great to learn, and I'm really glad I don't have to take finals or write papers anymore. It's awesome. There is also something called the National Poll on Healthy Aging out of the University of Michigan, with help from the Institute for Health Improvement and others. And this was fairly recent. The research, I think, was 2 years ago, but the scientific publication just this year. 88% of people feel more comfortable being themselves. 80% have a strong sense of purpose, which actually correlates with good old age. 67% feel more positive about aging as they age. It doesn't happen overnight. People get used to it, and you realize, like, hey, I'm actually kind of still me. 65% think their life is better than they thought it would be. But notice something about this, which is one of my pet peeves, and yes, I have told them to their faces. It's between ages of 50 and 80. So I think when you're the National Poll on Aging and you have a cutoff at 80, that's a little problematic to me. There are also things about aging that we can change. Yes, you still have to grow old, and you still have to die. And are there some people who want to make that different? Actually, sort of in this neck of the woods, yes. It's not clear they'll succeed in our lifetimes, and it's not clear they'll let people like us into it. It seems like you might have to be in Hollywood or be a trillionaire. But there are things all of us can do. And actually, the Brits do better with this than the US medical press. So Lancet, BMJ, have things about healthy lifestyles, live longer, and have less dementia. But that's not, can you do this? Can you make a big difference by changing your lifestyle at 85? You absolutely can. But if you started at 5 or 35 or 55, it's something that is lifelong and differences we can all make. And instead of making old age this thing that happens to you that comes like a train, we can empower people. A stage of life where disempowerment is assumed is not attractive to anyone. Okay, so now I'm moving from sort of science-ish to straight up anecdote. And so when you reimagine, you have to use your imagination. And the imagination is the ability of the mind to be creative and resourceful. And one of the things I see routinely in healthcare is people not being able to imagine that the old person can get better. So the response will be, oh, you're using that walker really well. Instead of, you're using the walker really well, and now we're going to add some weights because our goal for you is to walk independently again. But if the physical therapist or the clinician doesn't even believe that's possible, if the patient doesn't believe it's possible, it's not going to happen, but it is possible. It's scientifically proven. But here comes the anecdote. So this is from the great medical journal, the New York Post. Anna, age 85, so bent she had to stop driving. This was her at a wedding, and she just had pain all the time. So she had therapy from this woman whose name I really should know. This is like terrible. So she did this miraculous work, and I don't know her name, so apologies for that. So she began working with the therapist once a week. Now, anybody who's had any kind of physical therapy at any age knows that when this works, you actually have to work on it in between also. You can't just go once a week, just in case anybody missed that. So she actually did her homework in between sessions, and then look what happened. 85 years old. Imagination. But if you don't imagine it's possible, if you don't know it's possible, it's for sure not going to happen. Would we be able to do this with every single, octogenarian with that much bent Not necessarily. There are lots of etiologies, but it's for sure not going to happen if we don't try. So healthcare. I don't even know where to begin with healthcare, but anyway, let's just define the term. There are all these different words we use interchangeably, but they actually mean different things. So healthcare is the business of healthcare, and we know that often takes priority over what many of us like to think we do, which is healthcare. And then certainly it drives what many of us in medicine actually do, which is medical care. Medical care is care of diseases. Healthcare is care of health. It is helping people live well at every age, in every disability status, from every background, from every socioeconomic status. Our system does not do this very well, but ideally it would. Aging. So, I'm not going to tell you it doesn't have its downsides. It's generally defined biologically as the accumulation of a wide variety of insults and disabilities. Some things get too big, some things get too small, they don't function as well. That is part of it. How we get there can vary a lot. And then there's this huge sociocultural overlay. So at what age is a person old? I don't know if people saw, but this is sort of your neck of the woods, but there was an article in the New York Times, I want to say maybe 6 or 7 years ago now, talking about a retreat for older workers in Silicon Valley who are having a lot of stress, probably in part because they were older, and you had to be 30 to attend. I mean, yeah, where to go? Age discrimination in the workplace starts at 40. Lots of programs, like on my Instagram, I'm always getting things for people who are over 50, because of course 50 is the same as 80, which is the same as 105. And apparently that's very old. And then there's 60, which if you look across cultures and throughout time, old age has traditionally been defined generally as somewhere between 60 and 70. And we also know it really varies. If you are a Native American in South Dakota, you may be old at 46. And if you are a person of East Asian descent in Massachusetts, you may not be old until your 70s. A lot of factors come into play. So 70, pretty fair game. 80, there is this way of thinking about old age as sort of young old, and oldest old, or some people say go, what is it? Go slow, no go. So often that line is around 80, but I've given talks at, people may or may not know about Rossmore in the East Bay, which is this huge community for older people, and I gave a talk and I asked them what age they thought old was. So I got to 80, I got to 90, I got to 100, and there are all these people giggling because they're not owning it, not yet. So it's really a bit in the eye of the beholder to some degree. And then there was this Pew Research study where younger people thought old was younger and older people thought old was older. But interestingly, the younger people also thought young lasted longer than the older people thought young lasted. I'm not even sure if I'm saying that right. Another interesting thing was, at what age is a man old? And men and women agreed it was 70, but when asked what age a woman was old, the men said 68 and the women said 75. So do we think sociocultural factors are at play? I think probably. And then there is this book from a few decades ago, which is how a lot of Americans feel. But there is also this about aging, and this from the World Health Organization again. These changes are neither linear nor consistent, and they are only loosely associated with a person's age in years. The diversity seen in older age is not random, and it is more significant than for other age groups. You can have different parts age at different rates. So if you say someone's old, what does that even mean? You need to define that term much more clearly. I thought I should mention John Chauvin here, since he's Stanford, I think he's emeritus now, but sort of showing that with the advances in public health and medicine across the 20th century, what qualified you as middle age, old, or elderly changed. So instead of using traditional metrics, he sort of looked at your chance of dying, and according to your percent of chance of dying, mapped that out. And it did seem to get older. And I thought this was great when Barack Obama became president, because somewhere I saw a picture of him and Michelle, and it was like, oh, youthful president. And then they took something from 100 years earlier and showed people at the same age, and it was grandma and grandpa. So there are these huge changes that depend on all sorts of different terms. But in the US, our lives are getting shorter, right? This is about healthcare and medical care, or the absence of healthcare, the presence of healthcare without space between the words. Life expectancy is now 5 years shorter on average, and for some people much, much smaller. The American health disadvantage begins at birth and lasts throughout life. That's why longevity, if you're going to talk about aging, you have to start at birth or in utero. You have to consider epigenetics. It's not on off. And aging, often when I give talks, there is an older age skew, as if aging only should matter to older people. And the decrease in US life expectancy was experienced disproportionately by Blacks and Latinos. So again, sociocultural factors are huge. Population. The United Nations has named 5 megatrends, one of which is demographic shifts, particularly aging. But if you look at most health centers or health systems, and I'll come back to this in a little bit, there is very little attention to aging. And that's even more disproportionately, sort of biased when you consider that people at older ages require more medical care. And what we hear about that, instead of establishing systems and supports for older people and their health, is that they're using too much of the healthcare dollar. But when was the last time you heard someone say those children use a hugely disproportionate percentage of the education dollar? Right? You don't hear that. Old people get blamed for their needs, whereas other people are allowed to have their needs, and those are considered age-specific and not something to be punished for. When you look at population health rubrics, you'll often see things like this, and they're really important factors: income inequality, race, gender, education, so many things. But what's never mentioned? Age. I looked at a bunch of these, actually, to make this slide, and it's just not mentioned. So how do you think population health where you don't think about age, especially when you look at, this is sort of Steve Austat from Alabama via my colleague John Newman at UCSF. And these are the risk factors for heart disease, which remains the #1 killer. But actually, you can graph this differently, and it looks like this. So aging is something we need to pay attention to in healthcare. All right, so now I'm going to come to the second half of the talk. And for this, I really drew from Jonathan King. You just heard some of these words from him. And I had a little struggle because I gave Carrie my title long ago. And then I read his words. And so what I've tried to do is kind of think about how we can think about the system, but also think at a very individual, personal level that he was really speaking to. There are on the website a list of things that he recommended for all of us. So I'm going to use those to try and reimagine aging with thoughts about how we might change the healthcare system as well. It is one of those things where if we could do aging well, we could probably do almost everything else better. So Jonathan King said, the patient is your client and should be treated with respect. And for some of these comments, he gave more specificity. In this case, it was seek out and give full weight to your patient's suggestions and opinions on treatments. Now, we have to admit that this is really hard to do in 10 minutes when the computer needs to be tended to as well, and there are metrics that will decide whether you've done a good job or not, which may have absolutely nothing to do with what the patient wants from you. Never ever treat your patient as an object or as a second-class citizen. But if you follow the popular press about aging, you will very frequently see headlines like these. Talk to me, not my daughter. There is a certain infantilization, and do we all get shorter? We do. My mother, whom I reference frequently, I can now pretty much put my chin on her head and look over. But you know, she still talks, and her doctor talks to her, luckily, but that happens not frequently. And the system also contributes to this, right? If you have 10 minutes and somebody can't hear you, maybe because you're wearing a mask, just hypothetically speaking, Or if somebody is feeling sick, so their cognition is a little slower, it's going to take more time. And it also costs the person more to get there. And so a 10-minute appointment or even a 20-minute appointment may not make sense in terms of efficiency. Imagine if you had an hour where you could attend to all the different things, you could prioritize them together, and you could come up with treatments that could address more than one or two things together. This would transform care of older adults, but it would probably make primary care better generally. And one of the reasons the US is 36th in health outcomes internationally, 36th, we think we're the best. We're the best at some things, but we're 36th in health outcomes, is because we don't emphasize primary care. And we have this fractured system. And then this from Judith Graham, whom I love to follow. If you're interested in aging and health issues, Paula Spann, Judy Graham, there are some people who write consistently about these issues really well. They treat me like I'm old and stupid. This was actually, I actually sent her this person. It was a emeritus faculty at UCSF, a pharmacy PhD, who was still teaching on Zoom, age 85, I believe. And she has a variety of health problems, but still teaching on Zoom, right? And so she was in the ER, and they just wouldn't listen to her, and she had an infection, and they were going to give her an antibiotic that didn't make any sense, and she's the one who has the advanced degree in this, and they literally could not hear her. And they, yeah, I won't even, yeah. It was bad. Respect was not involved in her discharge at midnight with wet clothing. So the other thing he said was seek out and give full weight to your patient's suggestions and opinions on treatments. This also doesn't happen as much as it should. And again, part of that is time. And people make jokes about Dr. Google, but why are people Googling things? Because they're not sure they can trust the people they're going to see or that they'll have enough time to get their questions answered. And also because the internet is full of some really good stuff in addition to some really horrible stuff. So why not? Why is it bad for a patient to be engaged with their own health and care? Never a bad thing. Research also shows some things that should inform how we would restructure a healthcare system, and these include people tend to spend less time with older patients instead of more. So let's say you have more problems, we might have more trouble with communication, so let's spend less time with you. And then when the outcome is bad, let's blame old age. They're less likely to involve older patients in medical decision-making. Frequently dismiss symptoms. I actually thought of this the other day. Last Thursday, we had a grand rounds at UCSF on long COVID. And one of the speakers, who was fantastic, talked about how he had really become interested based on an op-ed in the New York Times by a young physician, I think she was 32, and she was describing how she was having more trouble breathing going upstairs after she'd had COVID, and she was feeling tired all the time, and she was just generally achy. And probably that was taken seriously because she was 32. Not everybody would do this, but imagine an 82-year-old going in and saying the same thing. Would we have diagnosed that it seems like a spectrum of conditions as quickly or readily or invested as much in it? Perhaps not. And then on the flip side, are there things that people come to see us with that we ascribe to age only because we haven't looked or thought or imagined differently? Chances are good that that's true. It has been true historically. Less likely to inform old patients and their families of expected death. Never helpful. How are you going to plan? How are you going to have the conversations you want to have? Less likely to ask about sexuality or discuss the ways treatments might affect sexuality. The number one reason older people don't have sex is the absence of a partner. Some people don't want to have it anymore. But for most people, that's actually not the issue. Are more likely to withhold treatments even after controlling for prognosis and patient preferences, and this was shown again in COVID. So ageism, defined as how we think, or stereotypes we have, which we all have in our heads, right? We're bombarded with this stuff. How we feel, which is prejudice. And how we act, which is discrimination. And I would argue that our healthcare system is blatantly ageist. It has a variety of other problems, which we're talking about more, but maybe not enough. And we all do this. I mean, part of how I came to write Elderhood was I entered my 50s and I started making sort of internalized ageism comments with my students about, oh, I used to do that, or, you know, these things that we all do. So it's not about blaming. It's about understanding that this is a natural response. We all start young. And for some insane reason, it surprises us when we grow old, and it's not just something that happens to other people. And you know, I haven't had a week in the last 30 years where somebody hasn't said to me, I feel just like me, and then I look in the mirror and I'm like, what happened? You know, so it's a universal experience. So it's not about blame, it's about doing better, right? We saw with the LGBTQ movement that the sort of care people got and the way we talked about things transformed, and people's attitudes, how they thought, how they felt, changed in the matter of less than a decade. Now, is that perfect? No, of course not. But again, if you don't try, you don't get anywhere. I just have to always mention the silver tsunami because it's so bad. I mean, it's so witty, right? Of course, it's sort of witty. But really, it's like a gray mass that's taking down the population. Instead of, we have these decades of extra life. And what are most people doing with it? They're contributing in all kinds of ways. But you have to think about contributions differently. And then you can't have a situation where you have forced retirement and then you say old people are a burden, right? Choose one or the other. Like, either let people keep working when they want to and can, or don't say they're a burden. Empathize, Jonathan King said. Put yourself in your patient's shoes as much as you can, and this is hard. When I was a young geriatrician, I thought of my patients as other. There's just no question. They were old people and I wasn't an old person. It was kind of like, you know, if I had a patient from Mali, they were from Mali and I'm not from Mali. Only I'm not going to become from Mali, but I'm rapidly becoming an old person. So and if people can look at these images and not feel empathy, you know, if you're in the last years of your life and you can't touch your daughter, you can't kiss your daughter. I mean, admittedly, we also lock up small children on our borders, you know, so it's not the only group, but this is unacceptable behavior, and a moral society has to stand up against it. You know, and it might also be okay to do it for a couple months at the start of a pandemic that is unprecedented. But then you would think harm reduction might enter in. How do we help? How do we weigh the pros and cons? Because we saw lots of people die of broken hearts, basically, or of total inactivity or hopelessness. I won't live long enough to see the other side of this, so I might as well just die now. And then, you know, show me a person who looks forward to this end of life. No one does. Should it exist? What do we do about it? Is it different to be dying when you're very old? Are there ways of postponing this? Are there ways of treating it with more humanity and compassion? I think the answers to all those questions are yes. And that it doesn't just take one approach, but many. But again, it doesn't happen without the imagination and the effort to try. James Baldwin famously said, obviously speaking of Black Americans, and this is another problem that has not been fixed, but people who treat other people as less than human must not be surprised when the bread they have cast on the waters comes floating back to them poisoned. When we say we're not old and we are old, when we talk about them as old, we create that situation we want to avoid. So how do we get people to think about, like, oh, I'm in elderhood now. It lasts decades and it has all these phases. I wonder which phase I'm in. I'm part of the generations who newly have all these decades. What can we do with this? Pre-pandemic, one of the two groups that was doing with the most startups and the most innovations were people in their 70s. And it was particularly women in their 70s. And that was in part because they could not get jobs anywhere. But it was also an opportunity that people grabbed hold of and hopefully will continue to. Are there reasons we do this? There's a whole lot of psychology, and I can't get into all of it, and I'm a little embarrassed with actual psychologists in the audience, but I'm just gonna touch on a couple things. So there's terror management theory, which is a negative bias against older individuals helps protect younger individuals from thinking about the negative aspects of dying. And remember back, like, it scares people. And it scares people in two ways, because if you have been able-bodied and there is some disability with aging, you don't look forward to that. We also live in a society that is very able, you know, full of ableism. and that overlaps with ageism a lot. We also live in a society where people are devalued when they're older. So we just make it something you wouldn't really look forward to, and it helps to separate yourself. There's also the functional approach, which is that stereotypes serve individuals because it helps sort of, it's efficient. Like, I'm going to categorize this person here, and then I can write off that category, or I can deal with it that way. And it also puts you in the social in-group if you're categorizing another group as an out-group. But we all end up one way or another in an out-group if we haven't been born into one. So it's a matter of sort of thinking about how would that feel? That empathy that Jonathan King talked about, like, how would that feel if it was me? I started with this picture. This is from San Francisco's anti-ageism campaign, and I kind of love it because these are all the same people. Their eyes are them now, and above and below is them in their youth. And it's really all about how the geriatrician Joanne Lynn said we're all older people in training until we're older people. And so inside a young person is an old person who hopefully will get a chance to flourish. And inside old people is that thing where you look in the mirror and you're like, wow, that's not how I think of myself. So it's all right there. Jonathan King also said, foster the patient feelings of control and hope, however small they appear scientifically. I want to add to this that sometimes they appear small scientifically because we haven't done the right research, or we haven't included older people in the research. It is true that if you eat more kale and blueberries and less processed food, you will probably be healthier. A little bit of genetics maybe, but not too much. Some luck, car accidents, etc. It's true, but we often sort of say, like, well, because you're an American, then you don't actually have to grow old, or, you know, like, how realistic is this for most of us? This is called the exceptional elder narrative, which is not helpful. So how do we do messaging about old age that is neither sort of utopian or something so far away that people can't relate to it, but also includes the positives and the possibilities? Internalized ageism, I mentioned before, and it is really negative. It means people won't seek care for things. You know, it can happen from physicians who blame, you know, say, well, that's just because you're old. Well, no, old is a risk factor for diseases. But people who have internalized ageism don't take care of themselves as well, and then it becomes self-fulfilling. We also know that probably through cortisol or stress levels, if you have a prejudice against yourself, different things happen in your body. So you are less likely to recover from a surgery. If you have positive attitudes, you will have your heart disease, your stroke, you know, maybe 7.5 years later. This is a lot of work from Becca Levy and her group at Yale. You're less likely, so if you have ApoE4, so this risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, but you have positive attitudes about aging, and this study was one that looked at people's attitudes when they were younger and followed them prospectively, or looked at a data set that did that, you were less likely to develop dementia. So there are all these ways in which our attitudes impact our physiology and our health. Yeah, so positive attitudes, I guess I forgot I had this slide, but, you know, less cognitive change, less depression, fewer functional limitations. There's a whole literature on this, but the healthcare system doesn't pay for us to help work with people's internalized ageism. It will pay for things that have much less data behind it and much less efficacy. So the thing will say, oh, the person's blood pressure was 142, you really want it lower than that. But that may be less of a risk factor for them than their attitude about their own aging and how it impacts what they do and how they feel. Jonathan King said, base this control and hope on a foundation of honesty. So we need to be honest about old age, but that's also honest about its potential. And he said, don't fear or disparage your patient's drive for alternatives. Help assure they are sensible. So where do we see that in aging? Well, the honesty is, you know, the older you get, the more likely you are to die. And eventually, it's 100%. And maybe that will change. I think counting on that is probably not putting your eggs in the right basket. On the other hand, you know, if we say old is 65, half the people are going to live 20 years. Now, again, it depends a lot on sociodemographics, but then there's all the other people who are going to keep living. And there is something in medical training where we used to say the longer you stay, because if you stayed in the hospital, there'd be more work, and then you'd stay in the hospital doing the more work, and so on. And it's also the longer you live, for the most part. So what are we doing with these decades, and how are we discussing that with people? Because it actually can be really helpful to focus people. You know, like people in your health and age category have this much time. You know, what's most valuable to you? This is also interesting in terms of what medicine does or doesn't do. So red is people 80 or older, people in their 70s in green, people in their 60s in blue. And you can basically fill in side effects, treatments, whatever else. And what it basically shows is the risk goes up with age. But notice something else, it also goes up historically. And this was partly because we couldn't do as many things here. And is this partly because when we do things, the things we've learned how to do are more targeted to younger people? Or is it because we don't include the older people in studies, so we don't know what to do? This is a product of medical advances, and it may not be entirely a product of age. There's something called e-prognosis, where you can put in information and get a sense of how long a person might live, very controversial. But when you're dealing with people who are dying, they will often say something like, I wish I had known a year or two ago, right? So maybe having a ballpark, knowing that it is not a crystal ball, can help you make either better decisions to change that prognosis or better decisions to enjoy your life in ways that have the most meaning for you. And that is known to be one of the advantages of getting older. You see the horizon change, and you're more likely to pick the thing that is meaningful to you than the thing that suits your vanity. And this is part of the age-friendly health system, is to think about what matters most to people. Jonathan King also said, help us urge the patient to build a support system. And I think about this a couple ways in old age. And again, this pulls in the social that we ignore in this country. So social isolation and loneliness are more and more common, particularly as you get older, because your parents will be dead, your spouse may be dead, your siblings, your friends. And it really hurts physical and mental health. So if we had a healthcare system, we would actually address that, and that would improve health and improve health outcomes and lower costs. But we have a medical care system, so we don't really address that. There's also the fact that people might need companions more as they get older if they're having trouble hearing or thinking or getting to the visit. But notice here where the percentage fall, right? It's still quite low. It also means that when we see old as only disabled and we create a system where we focus only on the frail elders, we're leaving out tons of people. What are we doing for everybody? What are the different reasons somebody might bring someone with them to an appointment? It's also true that geographies with higher ratios of social spending to healthcare spending have better health outcomes. This is data that's been available for decades, and we don't act on it. Another word from Jonathan King, encourage the patient to consult other sources of information. This is especially important with older patients because we don't teach about them. I hear you guys have 4 hours in medical school here on old patients. Yeah, which makes sense given their use of health services. We had a huge increase in our teaching, and we're up to 2 weeks now, so that's awesome. We're like miles ahead of you. So these are the vaccine schedules for kids. So the reason kids have so many different levels is because kids change a lot, and the immune system is different at birth. But it's also about social and behavioral factors, physiologic factors. Now, actually, immunology was a field that people made pretty good advances on in the 1800s, so just like a few years back where we've had this knowledge. But when you look at adults, you get 65 plus, because 65 is the same as 105. Like, how many centuries do we have to know that isn't true for your immune system to make a difference? And also, it still does this even though we know the higher dose flu shot is better, even though we know giving people certain drugs before they get a vaccine is better. And we sort of discussed how medical research is So in the 80s, it was mandated to include children in research that would influence children. Women and minorities. In the 90s, children. And in 2019, it was mandated to include older people in research. But interestingly, who got the COVID vaccine first? Yeah, old people, and particularly old people in facilities. What was the one group in whom the vaccine was not tested for either efficacy or side effects before being administered to? Yeah, old people. I am running a little over. Sorry about that. I get going. I'll keep going. So expect patients with a poor prognosis to alternate between a frantic search for solutions followed by calm commitment to a plan. Now, obviously, death is different from old age. But there are some similarities, and it's sort of over decades, and we see this, right? There is a huge anti-aging $43 trillion industry compared to what we put into the healthcare system, and a lot of this is like, pay me $30,000 and I'm going to fix your mother's Parkinson's, which, let's say, if it worked, like, we would give that to everybody, but it doesn't work. So. A lot of alternative medicine use in older people. And what this says to me is, number one, let's reimagine. Maybe some of these things really work. There is some science behind them, but we don't actually pay for that because nobody's going to make a lot of money and you can buy it over the counter. The other thing is, what it says to me is we're not meeting people's needs. And we have to pay special attention to this because one of the reasons people use this is who uses it are people in states bordering the Pacific Ocean. So, very apropos. Make every positive gesture. Ageist language is considered okay. Ageist jokes are considered okay. Even in these parts of the Bay Area where it's not okay to make racial jokes or jokes about people's sexual or gender identity preference. And for people who don't know, there is actually something called elder speak, where you speak to an old person the way you might speak to a puppy or a toddler. This is UCSF's health system DEI poster. So we welcome all races, religions, countries of origin, sexual orientations, genders, ethnicities, and abilities, but we're not so interested in old people. Never mind, it's a protected category. And I guess my best joke about this is at least they're honest. Make physical surroundings and institutional arrangements as pleasant as possible. We have this hospital for adults up here, and we're building a new one for adults. And we have this relatively new one for kids, which is full of art and plants and specialists. And then we have this thing called age-friendly health systems, where a few people in the hospital might ask older people how they're thinking or walking or what they prioritize. And I'm not saying this isn't progress, because it is. I'm just saying, I'm just not sure it's the same as a whole big building or campus with people who actually have the training to take good care of you. And maybe we get there by creating age-friendly communities, which is well beyond the scope of this talk. Support efforts to speed up attempts to apply promising but unproven treatments for patients with a fatal diagnosis. So is old age a fatal diagnosis? In some ways it is, but we have decades to work with, and that's super helpful. Geroscience, if you don't know about it, and I will talk about it more tomorrow at medical grand rounds, is the fundamental, it's like a paradigm shift. So instead of going after diseases, you go after the mechanisms that lead simultaneously to diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. This is one of the most exciting areas of science, and yet it's not necessarily associated with aging or geriatrics. And we should all be owning that as an area of excitement to get people interested in the science of aging. And the idea there is to maybe not lengthen lives, but keep us functional longer. And I guess one way of thinking about this is the difference between equality in these three kids. They're getting the same thing. It's not working very well for this poor little guy. And this is equity. Everybody gets what they need so they can fully participate in society. So when we talk about aging, people are like, oh, the pediatricians want this from us and this group wants this. But the one place there's blatant inequity, in addition to race, obviously, and gender to a lesser extent, but there is nothing about our health system that has age equity. Finally, the countries that do better start at the beginning. So how do we make old age better? We start with younger people also, and maybe part of the problem with old age is making it smaller and smaller and getting it far away from the whole lifespan. Whereas the way to get happy, healthy older lives is intergenerational interactions and starting earlier. So what I would say is the fundamental way to reimagine it is to create a system that helps you live the old age you want for yourself and the people you love. And I'm really sorry it went over.
Dr. Aronson, thank you so much for such an engaging and inspiring presentation. It's now our opportunity to open it up for questions and answers with Dr. Aronson for discussion. So if you have an inquiry for her, please feel free to just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. In the meantime, we have a QR code up here that you can pull up on your phone. It's a very simple survey, and for folks at home, please do the survey as well. It's really helpful to get this feedback every year because it helps us optimize the entire lectureship for the years ahead. So go ahead.
I'll just make a comment about QR codes. This is a generational thing, not an age thing, but not everybody over, the age cutoff is different for different people. But like if you go into a restaurant and that's the only way to get the menu, there's a certain number of people who have a lot of the wealth in this country who are going to go eat elsewhere. So, having other options might be a good idea in the age-friendly talk. And I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Also, for everyone that's registered, we have a link too that comes up to get the
Sorry,
survey.
I had to say it.
Nice. Hi, Dr. Aronson. My name's Apurva. I'm a second-year medical student here, and I've had my 4 hours of geriatrics.
Hooray!
So I guess my question for you is something like, if you had a magic wand to reimagine medical education, I'm curious what some of the suggestions or ideas that you have could be.
Well, people have tried all these different reimagining things. It's interesting that we hold different standards for different sorts of things. Some things get done because they were always done, and that's changed a little bit. My father was in medical school in the 50s, and he had a full year of anatomy, and that was all they did. I mean, they also had like 4 medications they could give people, but so it was a little different, admittedly. I think we need to rethink what we need to know and when. Tech needs to be part of it from the very beginning. That's how people learn now. If you've been doing tech since you were 12 months old, how should that inform how we're teaching different things? I think, I would have to think more about it, but sort of the usual progression is sort of what's normal and what's abnormal. But what's normal is normed on a tiny segment of the population, right? So generally it is a white heterosexual male who weighs 70 kilograms and is able-bodied and is between the ages of 20 and 40. There are people in that category, and we absolutely want to take good care of them. But then there's really everybody else, which is the vast majority of human beings. And if you norm to something like that, you're making everybody else abnormal. So how about for each organ system, you sort of talk about the range among people, including age groups and pathologies, all, you really get the fuller spectrum of that. And I guess the other thing I would do would be to make the amount of time you spend doing things and training proportional to what would create the health system that would create the best health outcomes, which means less inpatient, more outpatient, because right now we incentivize not only being in the hospital, but being in the ICU. And like, who's really, like, do you want to spend the night in the ICU tonight? Like, I don't. I would like to go home and lie in my bed, and, if I need to see my doctor, I would do that, some other time. So making it proportional, and that's population, including older people. And I should say that I think geriatrics has been part of the problem here. We making it smaller and smaller, or saying like, here, I'm going to teach you geriatrics, I'm going to take you to a nursing home. Which, as we saw from the photos, like nobody's looking forward to living there, and maybe nobody's looking forward to working there, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't provide good care there. It means we need to think much more broadly, and most people don't live there. So you're also sending a message like, this 2 to 4% of the population is geriatrics instead of the 17 to 20%. So I think I would just restructure the amount of time we spend on things. Do we need that many dermatologists? We might need more primary care docs. Not to pick on dermatologists, but So thank you for the question. Yeah, right there.
I am not a doctor, so probably it's wasted time, but I come from South America. Mm-hmm. And one of the characteristics over there is the mobility. And I was born in one place, I stayed for 25 years, then I came to the States. And I think that one of the fundamental issues about healthcare for aging is related to the presence of family in your life. Now, there's nothing you can do in the United States. The majority of people at 18 years old go away. But is there any way that a medical profession can include family in a more efficient way, or is there anything you can do about that? Or, I don't know. That's it.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So how do we include family, and people moving is a problem. There are some people who sort of push back on the U-shaped curve of happiness, talk about the two things that actually lead to the most successful old age are being near family, particularly kids, and having money. I like to tell my students it's like better to have more money than less money at every age, including when you're old, in case that's not obvious. Yeah, we also, it's gotten a little better, but if you are taking care of somebody who's really ill of any age, or somebody with complex illness, or somebody who's older and has some impairments, you have to be able to speak to the family or the caregivers or somebody else. You also want to ask that person's permission. So I don't think it's something we just do, behind somebody's back. But you're often not paid for that time, or it's not, even though we know it'll lead to better outcomes, should we give a little more time when there are 4 people in the room? It might actually prevent a hospitalization. But those are among the things that we just don't work into the health system. We also know that if you can take good care of the caregiver, the patient will do better. But the caregiver is sometimes also your patient and sometimes not. And I think this comes down to the whole industry of caregiving. And caregiving has traditionally been free labor from mostly females. Men are doing much more caregiving, still not an even share. But it's kind of like we pay teachers really low salaries, even though we say our kids are the future. They're just things that don't make any sense. So I think including families and making time and compensation for that and rewards for that would be great, because it's actually harder to have a good family conference than to, freeze off a lesion on your arm or remove a cataract or take out an appendix. And are there other things that are really more complex? Yes, but we just don't recognize those relational skills and needs. And so having codes for that might help, I think. And then also a culture that realizes how important it is and respects it.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your talk. Your book is a masterpiece, but that's besides the point. I noticed in your talk a lot of discussion of the intersection between ableism and ageism in healthcare, and I was wondering if you could say more about how disability is similar and distinct from aging and ageism, or vice versa?
Such a good question. I actually have a whole other talk on that topic because it's so important. So he's asking about ageism and ableism and how they overlap and intersect and influence each other. So you can be disabled from birth. You can acquire disability. You can be disabled and then become old. You can become old and then become disabled. So there's all these areas of overlap, and yet in typical human fashion, there's a lot of tribalism about, they'll often lump on city or county committees, aging and disability services. And then you end up with these factions that are like vying for their piece of the pie, right? You've seen this too. And it's just counterproductive, but, like look at human history. So I don't know, but I think we should try to do better. And there's also this sense, because disability is so disrespected in our society, that people who acquire disabilities with age are entering two categories of less respect, right? So disability and old age. And that just adds to the lack of, the denial of it or the pushing of it away. So I think if we could make a society that was less ableist and had more access for everybody, that it would help with aging a lot also. And as people with disabilities now live into old age, we need to be getting more training about how to take good care of those people. So, I wish we could do more with that. There's so much overlap. Thank you.
Have you recorded that other talk?
That is a good question. Somebody has. I may or may not have access to it, but if you send something to Carrie, I will see what I can do. Okay.
We'll take one more question.
So for a lot of different groups, concerns about communication, adequate communication between patients and physicians have pointed out that having the physicians or the clinicians be similar or from similar groups to patients can be beneficial. Is there similar kinds of concerns about the age of clinicians relative to the age of patients? Because you keep finding younger physicians, seems like every year, and for those of us who are getting older, it may be harder.
They keep getting younger. We're not changing a bit.
Younger. It's
I
very
know.
strange. But is there a concern about that? Especially, it does seem like there's clinicians retire earlier than some other professions, and so I was wondering if that's something that's an area of focus to make the healthcare providers more representative of some of the patients who they see.
Yeah, that's a great question. So talking about, there's a lot of data for race, gender, for a variety of demographic characteristics where if the patient and physician are from the same group, the outcomes are often better. I don't, to my knowledge, I don't know if anybody else knows, I haven't seen that for age. Physicians used to not retire. This is a relatively recent phenomenon with electronic medical records and burnout and paperwork and less time with patients, et cetera. So that's another area where if we reimagine the healthcare system, the good parts of medicine are so meaningful, and most people go into it for those human interactions, for making a difference in someone's life. But if the system is preventing you from doing that, you go. I will say anecdotally that now that I have gray hair, I have patients come see me and they're like, I have this new primary and she or he is really sweet, but I swear they're 12. I mean, they tell me they're 32, right? Or then they said this, and I see what he meant. And at the same time, how could I speak to somebody like that? So I think there probably is something to it. One of the things that I've been a fan of is there some way, because one of the exciting things about getting older is sort of retraining and learning things and developing new interests. So would there be a way, we actually just trained a fellow in her 50s, which is great, and she just made a career shift, and then we hired her. Could we get more people into geriatrics as they reach a certain age and begin to appreciate what they don't know that's harming their patients, or what they'd like to know even for themselves and their families? I think it would be a nice approach, and really anything would help.
Great. Well, Thank you so much, Dr. Aronson. Truly inspiring. And Dr. Aronson graciously has agreed to give our Stanford Medicine Grand Rounds tomorrow morning, and she'll also be presenting at our Stanford Medicine in the Muse event too this Saturday. So she has a marathon here at Stanford. For everyone who's here in person, and there's a lot of expertise in the room between palliative care, geriatrics, leaders at Stanford Healthcare, the community, the disability community, please feel free to be outside. We have an hors d'oeuvres reception available for everyone for a continued conversation with Dr. Aronson. And for those of you who are viewing for our live stream, thank you so much for joining. We very much look forward to seeing everyone again next year. Take care.